who gets all of the glory because many of his buildings have been named to the National Register of Historic Places and are still around. Mr. Hoagland preceded him, and very few of his buildings actually have survived. So we invited him here today to tell you something of his story.
My name is Orrin Alonzo Hoagland, and I was Chariton's first and most prolific architect. You may call me Lon. And yes, I know that William Lee Perkins is much better known as an architect. He designed many of those Chariton buildings now on the National Register of Historic Places. But I died too young. Too many of my buildings have been demolished in the name of progress, and I left only a grandson, age 10, when I died, to tell my stories. So I have been largely forgotten. I was born September 8, 1859, in the village of West Liberty, Missouri, west of Unionville and not far south of the Iowa state line in Putnam County. My father was John W. Hoagland, a physician, and my mother was Elizabeth. My father was 50 when I was born, and my mother a dozen years younger. She had been left a widow with 4 children when her first husband, Nicholas Jarvis, died, and then married Dr. Hoagland during 1858. Even though we lived close to Iowa, northern Missouri was not a good place for Union loyalists to live as the Civil War threatened and then broke out. So not long after my birth, my parents moved north to a village of Livingston in southwest Appanoose County, where my sister, Catherine, was born in 1862. My father died soon after Catherine's birth, and so we were raised by my mother in Appanoose County. Catherine went on to marry J.J. Moore, and they settled in Illinois. Mother eventually moved to St. Joe, Missouri, near some of my Jarvis half-brothers, and died there at the age of 75. I was raised near Moulton, also in Appanoose County, and came to Chariton in 1875 when I was 15, with my uncle Bannock Hoagland, a carpenter by trade. It was from him that I learned the basic skills of building trade. My uncle moved on to Kansas after a couple of years and suggested I accompany him. But I have formed an attachment to Miss Harriet Neff, daughter of Joseph and Sarah, who farmed near Chariton. Although she was only 17, we decided with her parents' permission to marry, and did so on the 15th of October in 1877. I was 18 at the time. Now on my own, I was fortunate to find employment in 1878 with Mr. William Layton, still in his 20s but well on his way to becoming Chariton's leading contractor. We formalized our relationship as a partnership, William Layton and Company, and then Layton and Hoagland during 1880. If I learned the basics of carpentry as an apprentice to my uncle, I developed the basic skills needed to design buildings and carry them through to the end of the construction time. He was only 38 when he died of cancer on the 28th of December in 1892, leaving a widow and 3 children. When it became evident that Bill Layton would not recover, I opened my first solo office in 1892 in the Warren Duggins building on the north side of the square, and advertised my services as an architect for the first time. I had been in the trade leading up to this for 14 years. I calculated and was well prepared. At the time in Iowa, there were no college programs in architecture. One learned as an apprentice. And so during those years, I had worked as a carpenter and contractor. I had also arranged to spend a few months during the slow winter seasons each year in Des Moines, working in the offices of architectural firms, most notably Foster and Lee, designers of the Lucas County Courthouse. I also had become deeply involved in my community. I became a charter member of the Chariton Volunteer Fire Department, serving in the Hook and Ladder Company. Harriet and I were active members of the St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, where I served many years on its vestry and was licensed by the Bishop of Iowa to lead services in the absence of the priest. If you visit St. Andrew's today and notice 6 tall gold candlesticks on the high altar, 2 of them were given in memory of me. And I devoted a great deal of time to Chariton's fraternal lodges. As a member of the Orion Lodge number 64, Independent Order of Oddfellows, I held many local, regional, and state offices. I was very active, too, in the Chariton lodges. And there were many And then there were my chickens. I had always fancied poultry, and chickens didn't require much space and could be kept in town. Exotics were a hobby of mine from the 1870s forward. That led at the turn of the 20th century to a farm south of town where I raised cattle. Had I not been an architect and builder, I would much have rather been a farmer. My first major commission in Chariton was the new Baptist church, built during 1892 and 1893 at the intersection of Grand Street and Linden Avenue. Some of you will remember the polished red bricks toward the gables and the steeples acres of stained glass and dazzling flight of steps to its front doors. Sadly, it was demolished during the late 1950s and obsolete and replaced with the current church building. I was also a proud member of Company H, Iowa National Guard, and designed the Armory building for the South Main and Armory Avenue during the 1895. That building later burned. And then there was the Lucas County home, constructed just northwest of Chariton during 1904. A Hy-Vee distribution center now occupies that site. As the 19th century closed, I was very pleased but focused on local projects ranging from houses and barns to public buildings and commercial structures. But after 1900, as my reputation grew, I became what sometimes seemed insanely busy, designing school buildings, churches, Carnegie libraries, hotels, and other commercial structures. I learned to work on trains, and I traveled to and from Chariton almost daily. I was success professionally and financially, but there was great sorrow too. Our eldest Justin, all of my children preceded me in death. Our eldest Justin, born during 1878, died a year later. Then, to the Great Plague, tuberculosis, known as the consumption, claimed the others between 1897 and 1912. Joseph Emery, born 1880, was just 17 when he died. Daisy, born 1882, married John Blouse, giving birth to our only grandchild. She became critically ill in 1908 and died on the 18th. Grief over work and perhaps a family history of heart trouble claimed my life a month later. On August 8, 1912, Harriet and I drove to Lenox to visit relatives and also had to sign the contracts for a new hotel I had designed there. I was in the bank having just signed the contract when I suffered a fatal heart attack at the age of 52. Harriet continued to live in the family home on North Grand Street where she raised our grandson. She lived to be 87, passing on the 4th of February, 1947. Our grandson, Hoagland, spent much of his life in Chariton. He married Beulah Marie Kendrick during 1925. They had 2 children, Jean Blouse-Clore and Jim Blouse, who brought me 4 great children to carry on my story. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next storyteller is Mary Sutphen Scott Howard, who's making her way from her grave even as we speak.
If you play local history trivia,
Pull the microphone closer.
I have a question for you. Whose remains occupy the oldest marked grave in Lucas County? My name is Polly Howard, and as you might have guessed, the grave just over there is mine. I did not live long in Lucas County, only from April of 1850 until October, when I took sick and died. But I do have that distinction. Home, during my brief lifetime here, was historic Chariton Point, encompassed in a 320-acre purchase made by my husband, John Howard, and myself on November 29, 1849, the first warranty deed recorded for Lucas County land. Our cabin home had been occupied by the legendary Buck Townsend and his family, and may have included a shanty built by the Mormon pioneers who overwintered here in 1846 to 47 and claimed the land by preemption that spring. We also purchased during May of 1850 from the government 160 acres in Benton Township, a couple of miles southeast. That land incorporated the Mormon grave around which Salem Cemetery grew, just as our acres here at Chariton Point included the Mormon graves around which the cemetery you now call Douglas Pioneer developed. So although I've been largely forgotten, I am embedded deep in Lucas County history, both literally and otherwise. I am native to Pennsylvania, born during 1802 in Northumberland County. As a child, I moved west with my family to Jackson County, Indiana, where I married my first husband, Jacob Scott, on the 3rd of July, 1824, when I was 22 years old. Jacob was a dozen years older than I, and we had 3 children before his untimely death at the age of 45 in Jackson County, 10 years later, during 1834. All 3 of my children became honored residents of Lucas County, whose descendants now number in the hundreds at least. They were Aaron Salter Scott, Anna Marie Scott Bentley, and Cyrus Douglas Scott. 2 years after Jacob died, I married as my second husband, John William Howard, during 1836 in Morgan County, Indiana. I was 34 at the time, and John, recently widowed with 4 young children, was 8 years younger, only 26. During the next few years in Indiana, we became the parents of 5 more children, concluding with Thomas, born during 1845, when I was 42, and only 5 years old when I died at the age of 47. John did not linger in Lucas County after my death, so none of these children ever lived here after that, or would be remembered by many who did. But my 2 families remained in touch with each other as the younger ones grew up at Fairfield, and their older half-brothers and sister married and flourished here in Lucas County. Pioneers from Indiana flooded into Iowa during the later 1840s, responding to the government's offer of land, formerly occupied by Native Americans, but now for sale to white settlers at $1.25 per acre. My Scott children, Aaron, Annie, and Cyrus, were the first of my immediate family to head west in the fall of 1848, just after Aaron's marriage to Elizabeth Wells. They stopped with kinfolk in Fairfield until the spring of 1849, then came on west to Lucas County, where both Aaron and Cyrus made preemption claims to 120 acres each, southeast of Chariton Point. John and I gathered the younger children and made the trip west after harvest that fall, stopping for the winter as my older children had done at Fairfield, then on the edge of civilization. The federal land office was located in Fairfield then, and John was able to make a deal with a speculator named Hugh Sample, buying 320 acres at Chariton Point for $350. That included a log house and a few plowed acres during November of 1849. We moved there in the spring and recorded the deed, the first warranty deed recorded in Lucas County. We also purchased another 120 acres from the government that May, a tract that includes the current location of Salem Cemetery in Benton Township and near my son Aaron's farm. That Chariton Point land had a history of its own by the time we bought it. Claim to it had been made first during the spring of 1847 by members of the Nickerson Party, Mormon pioneers who had been trapped by harsh weather and forced to spend the winter down along the Chariton River there. Although Lucas County land could be claimed at that time, the survey was not complete, so it couldn't be purchased yet from the government. So preemption claims were made, then bought and sold as if the property were deeded. So the Nickerson men made claims to help them out financially when they continued their westward journey. When spring came and the Nickersons' oxen had gained enough strength as grazing improved to pull wagons, they were anxious to head farther west. So the Venerable Thomas Brandon, then living as a young man at Iconium in far northwest Appanoose County, traded 2 heifers and a 3-year-old cow for their claims and log shanties at Chariton Point. A year later, in the spring of 1848, having spent the winter with him, Mr. Brandon sold out to a surveyor, entrepreneur, and all-around rapscallion named Buck Townsend for a 2-horse wagon and a horse. Mr. Townsend had hoped to profit mightily if Lucas County's seat were to be located on his land when Chariton was located and named during September of 1849. But that was not to be. The selected site was a ways north. Buck, then anxious to move along in search of new opportunities, sold out to Mr. Sample, from whom we purchased it, packed his family, and moved to far southwest Iowa. John and I moved our family into the Townsend cabin when we moved up to Lucas County during the spring of 1850 and got to work. But as I said, my time in Lucas County was short, and by October of that year, I was critically ill, and on October 17th, I died. There was considerable discussion about where to bury my remains. There were Nickerson family graves, including that of the family patriarch, Elder Freeman Nickerson, on our land at Chariton Point, at a place you now call Douglas Pioneer Cemetery. A few others had already been buried there too. But there were those in Chariton who proposed starting a new city cemetery on a pretty hilltop just a block west of the Chariton Square. Eventually, it was decided that I should be buried there, the first interment. After I died, John decided to move our large family of young children back to Fairfield, where he had relatives and friends who could help him with their care. So he divided the Chariton Point tract into 3 parcels and sold them off. He had returned to Jefferson County by Christmas. On April 20th, 1851, John married the widowed Gracie Ann Doty, who had been left a widow with 4 young children when her first husband died. They went on to have 5 children of their own by the time of his death during 1870 at the age of 59 at Fairfield. Back in Lucas County, my Scott children prospered. Aaron and Elizabeth raised a large family in Benton Township. Annie married the village blacksmith, John A.J. Bentley, and they lived long and productive lives in Chariton. Cyrus married Eliza Jane Wilson, and they raised a large family on their farm, also in Benton Township. My original grave did not fare so well. By the time the Civil War was winding down, it had become evident that the site just west of the square was too small and would impede the city's growth if it remained there and was expanded. As a result, this new cemetery, where we are now, was established during 1864, and arrangements were made to remove all who had been buried near the square to the new location. On the 7th of June, 1865, my children, Annie Bentley and Cyrus Scott, purchased adjoining lots here. My remains were relocated to the Cyrus Scott lot, as were the remains of one of his infants and 2 infant children of Annie and John A.J. Bentley were relocated to their new lot. The former cemetery site in Chariton became the location of the city's first large school building and remains the site of a newer version, Columbus Elementary School. Several other Lucas County pioneers had died before I passed, but their graves were marked only with wood and field stones and have by now vanished. But John Howard was determined that I would be remembered, so he ordered the fine stone that still marks my resting place and had it inscribed with my name, his name, and the names of my parents. When my remains were moved, so was the stone.
I'm getting a little careless about identifying people. That was Ruth Stufflebeam, depicting Polly Howard, and Chris Lang depicted Orrin Hoagland. So, last on the agenda today is Anna, Margaret, Redling Schaefer, Rosa, Wolf. And she will tell you at the end of her presentation who she really is.
Guten Tag, meine Damen und Herren, ich heiße. Or should I say, my name is Anna Margaret Redling Shaver Rosa Wolf. My first 24 years were spent in the Kingdom of Bavaria, so native German slips out sometimes. I was born and raised a farmer in the Germanies, and not according to the Iowa pattern. But as soon as I could afford an Iowa farm, I bought one for myself. My parents, George and Dorotha Redling Schaefer, lived in the tiny hamlet of Heinersdorf, west of Nuremberg, with their children and livestock, but our fields and pastures were scattered widely in the surrounding countryside. My birth occurred on the 28th of February, 1824, in Heinersdorf. I was baptized the next day in the Lutheran parish in the Church of Langensen. Just down the road, my eldest of my father's second family. There were 2 older brothers and a sister from his first marriage, and when all was said and done, 8 by his second. 11 children in all of whom eventually became proud citizens of the United States of America. My parents were cousins, both Redling Schaefers, but then everyone was related in our small cluster of farms and villages settled first in the 17th century, when the family was deported from Austria because we were Lutheran and not Catholic. I attended school in our village until I was 13, then was confirmed on the 12th of May, 1837, in the church at Langensen. I had sufficient knowledge of religion, the pastor wrote, a good knowledge of reading, sufficient knowledge of writing, but only sketchy understanding of mathematics. I think he may have been overly pessimistic about my mathematics, as I developed into an astute businesswoman. As the years passed, the political situation in the Germanies became more and more unsettled as Prussia moved to dominate her sister states. In addition, there were no more land for our crowded villages for my brothers to farm. These circumstances caused my parents to look to America. The eldest children, James and Barbara, were sent first to establish a home base. Then, in April of 1848, after our property in Bavaria had been sold and converted to gold, we were boarded ship at Hamburg for the trip. There were 11 in the party, the youngest of whom was my baby sister, Anna Elizabeth, just a year old. I was 24, and left behind in Germany a young man who had courted me, John W. Rosa. We were welcomed in America and brought from Baltimore to southwestern Pennsylvania by our brother James, then spent the winter with our sister Barbara Fisher until our new home was ready. John Rosa arrived from Germany the year later, and we were married on the 12th of June, 1850, at Aunt Barbara's home. Soon after our marriage, John and I moved to St. Louis, Missouri, where he worked as a tailor until 1855. We then moved to Perking, Illinois, where John opened a tailor shop, and in 1857, we established a cigar store in Peoria. And in 1860, we moved again, this time to Bureau County, Illinois, where we established a grocery store at Depew. In the meantime, a majority of my siblings had moved west too. My parents joined my sister and brother-in-law, Mary Anna and John Dittmer, in Guttenberg, Iowa in 1854. My father died there 2 years later, during January of 1856, age 69. My brother, John G. Redling Schaefer, was the first of the family to settle in Lucas County during 1857, and he was joined there as his years passed by my brother, George, and sister and brother-in-law, Margaret Anna and Aaron Hupp. In 1859, my widowed mother and youngest siblings, John Lott and Elizabeth Anna, also moved to rural Chariton to make their home with George. John and I and our 4 children, John Jr., Adam, Anna Margaret, and Lott, left Illinois behind in 1864 and joined the family in Lucas County, traveling by rail to Eddyville, where we crossed the Des Moines River by ferry and came the rest of the way to Chariton by stagecoach. I was 40 when we arrived in Chariton, and my childbearing years were past. Our children's arrival had brought us so much joy, but considerable sorrow too. Out of the 10 I gave birth to, 6 had died young in Illinois, and little Lot died soon after we arrived in Lucas County at age 18 months. But we were a persistent family. All of Lucas County's Rosas, and there are several of them, descended from John Jr. and Adam. Many Shreks descended from daughter Anna Margaret. Our first home in Chariton was in the southwest part of town, on the lots now occupied by Woodland Apartments. But in 1866, we purchased a log house just off the northwest corner of the Chariton Square, immediately north of where the Chariton Hotel now stands. In addition to our home, this building served as John's tailor shop, and we opened a small cigar shop there too. But tragedy struck on the 23rd of October, 1867, when John died at age 45 of typhoid fever, most likely caused by contaminated drinking water. I was left a widow at 43, with children ages 5, 7, and 10 to support, but was not without resources. Both John and I had been careful with our money. I turned our log home just off the square into a boarding house and invested my cash into a 120-acre farm adjoining that of my brother, John G., south of Chariton in Benton Township. This was an investment for our children and for my old age. One of my boarders in Chariton after John's death was Joachim Wolf, a native of Prussia who found work building the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad west of Chariton to the Missouri River. Joachim was of similar age and had arrived from Germany via Quebec and was not yet fluent in English, and we became fond of each other. So we were married on the 28th of November, 1868. I kept my home in Chariton as an investment property, but we moved to the farm in Benton Township, where Joachim took charge of it. He was a hard worker, and we prospered. Joachim and I had a good marriage, and he was content to farm with my sons, John and Adam, until he died at age 71 on August 2nd, 1893. I buried him near John and Lot here in the Chariton Cemetery. I continued to live in the home farm for as long as I was able. John had married Sarah Minerva Chenoweth in 1891, and their home was less than a mile east. Adam had married Catherine Stockman in 1887, and they lived just northeast of the home place. So I was well taken care of, and they took care of the farm. When it became impractical for me to live alone, I moved in with my daughter and son-in-law, Margaret Anna and William Schreck, a few miles southeast, where I died on the 7th of February, 1906, age 82. Funeral services were held on February 9th at Audubon United Brethren in Christchurch, just west of my home. This was the congregation of my children and most of their Redling Shaver folk. But I was baptized German Lutheran, confirmed German Lutheran, and died German Lutheran. One of the only disappointments we experienced in Lucas County was the fact that the only Lutheran church in Chariton was full of Swedes, and we could not understand the language their services were conducted in. But I persevered in my Lutheran faith, other than my mother, the only family member to do so. We're all buried here in Chariton now, my 2 husbands, little Lot, myself, and my children, John, Adam, Margaret Anna, and their families. I'm Molly Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, thank you. That pretty much concludes our program. Unless somebody here would like to do another one and come up with it yourself. You're welcome to tell your story. I'll be glad to turn the microphone over to you. If not, does anyone have any questions that we can answer for you? If not, I'd invite you to have some lemonade and enjoy yourself on this beautiful afternoon. We enjoy doing this every year. The weather cooperates, and we've been very grateful because this has been an especially beautiful day. And you've been a very attentive audience. Thank you very much.